你好，我是Charlene，欢迎收看这一期的《天下纵横谈》。有人说历史是一面镜子，能够折射出来；也有人说历史是一部教科书，可以解惑。当然，也有人说历史是会押韵的。历史是在不同的形式不断的重复当中，时而顺序，而时而倒叙。每一代的人都在书写着自己的历史章节。透过了解我们到底是从哪里来，可以更好的了解出我们是谁。亚裔美国人的沧桑历史是美国历史的缩影，能够引导我们走出今天的困境，教会我们如何的面对未来。在今天的天下中文谈当中，我们非常荣幸邀请到了 Dr. Fawn Chung， 他是著名的作者，同时也是 UNLV 的 Professor。Hi, Dr. Chung.
The Chinese first came to the United States and North America in the late 18th century, and we see carpenters and seamen arriving, and also American captains going to China, bringing back Chinese cabin boys and educating them in the United States. So that's one group. But the real push to coming to the United States occurred with the discovery of gold in 1848 in California, and that drove or encouraged thousands of Chinese to come to the United States and especially to settle on the West Coast. The next big draw was to work on the railroads, and there were many railroads built, beginning with, in the 1850s, the San Jose-San Francisco line, which used primarily Chinese railroad workers, who were then picked up by the Central Pacific Railroad that used not only domestically hired Chinese, but went over to China to bring over at least 10,000, maybe even 20,000 Chinese to work on the railroad. And the first transcontinental railroad was completed in 1869. And this coincided with the rise of the American labor movement. And this was a really bad time for this to happen because the labor movement decided to attack the Chinese, and they were joined by politicians who wanted to have voters focus on an issue that was negative, and that was a negative issue. So we see from about 1870 to 1900, the rise of anti-Chinese movements. And in fact, recorded on the Pacific Coast states were over 100 incidents of Chinese attacks and so forth, with 143 Chinese recorded officially as being murdered and about 10,500 being dislocated from the places where they had lived. So this was really a trying time for the Chinese. Although they won some cases in the courts, especially in the Supreme Court, that really helped them, it was a time of violence and a time of really horrible living. In addition to that, in 1875, the Page Law was passed, and this meant that any Chinese woman who wanted to come to the United States had to prove that she was not a prostitute. And if you think about that, that is difficult to do, especially if you don't know English. So we see a drop in the number of women coming to the United States and what we might call a legally created bachelor society, though most of the men were not bachelors, but had wives back in China, a bachelor society for the Chinese in America for many years. Then in 1900, what we see, well, in 1882, we see the first passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then corollaries or additional acts to strengthen that, so that by 1904, the Chinese laborers and those classified as laborers, including ministers and doctors and so forth, were prohibited from entering the United States. The Chinese retaliated, you might say, by inventing the paper son aspect, allowing others to come in as paper sons or daughters or wives of Chinese already in the United States. Then in 1906, the government decided to take a census. It actually started in 1903 of the Chinese who were here in the United States. Now, they didn't do a good job, but they did manage to say that anyone without documentation and papers could be deported immediately. And to show you how harsh this could be, in Boston in 1903 or 4, they arrested 300 Chinese, just picked them up off the street, took them to jail and said, "Where are your papers?" And they said, "Oh, we don't have papers, but we'll get our papers to you." And of the 300 that were arrested, only 3 men were deported. In other words, all those men had experienced the trials and tribulations of being arrested and put into jail. Then we see in 1924, the government decides that they're going to limit the number of Chinese who could come to the United States. And so the National Quota Act was passed, and about 100 Chinese from anywhere in the world could enter the United States, but that's all. So you have this great limitation, and the population continues to decrease rather than increase, and it is still a predominantly male population. But something happens at this time, and that is Chinese Americans, that is native-born Chinese, began to grow up, and they decided to create societies like the Chinese American Citizens Alliance. It was started in 1895, but really got underway in 1920, and they started to fight for the rights of Chinese, not only Chinese Americans, but also those Chinese trying to immigrate who were stopped illegally or unconscionably, and defend them and pay for the lawyer's fee and so forth. And one of the things that was happening is that the second and third generation in the 1900 to 1950 period were beginning to become professional people, including several lawyers, doctors, and you name it, people with money who could affect a change in government. Another big change occurs with the beginning of World War II, when the United States has to be an ally with China against Japan. And so feeling guilty about this whole situation and their treatment of the Chinese, the government passed, with a lot of help from Chinese American organizations like CACA, the repeal of the 1943 repeal of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and all exclusion acts that were related to it. This allowed women to start to come to the United States, create families with their husbands whom they might not have seen since their marriage way back when. And in fact, some wives said, "Oh no, you look so different now." I mean, they hadn't seen the guy for 20 years. And of course he looked different. But anyway, they started families and communities. And all of a sudden you see again, a real change in the Chinese American community. So then in 1950, the American press got the idea that the Chinese were the model minority, and glass ceilings were now broken so that some Chinese could progress upward in industry, in medicine, in engineering, and in other fields. And it was a real eye-opener and a real expansion of what the Chinese felt that they could do and what they could achieve. Then, to top this off, the Chinese Americans became active in the establishment of Chinese American Studies or Asian American Studies in San Francisco State University, the University of California at Berkeley, were two of the leaders in this movement. And what do you get out of this start? Well, that is, beginning in 1968, you get more objective and interesting studies of the lives and experiences of Chinese Americans. Many of the studies broke the misinformation of earlier studies by Americans and even Chinese Americans and even Chinese scholars in the United States that weren't true about what the Chinese experience was like in the past decades. Then finally, what we see happening towards the end is that in 1965, the Immigration Act removes all racial bias from America's immigration laws. And you see then a great influx of Chinese from all over the world coming to the United States and changing the nature of the Chinese American communities by adding then the breadth of not just coming from the southeastern provinces, particularly Guangdong and Fujian, but all provinces being represented in the United States. And in addition to that, they bring their food, their culture, their customs, Mandarin language instead of just Cantonese. And we see a whole plethora of interesting things developing, including in the 1970s, the most numerous ethnic restaurants in the United States were Chinese. Chinese food was so adored that it even outpopulated McDonald's, which was just getting started and growing at that time. But the trouble for the Chinese didn't stop. There was still evidence of hatred. And one of the key incidents was in 1982, when Vincent Chin, a Chinese American who was about to be married, was killed by two white Americans, and his killers were given probation and let go. And it was a horrible situation, not only for Vincent, his fiance, and his mother, but just the whole Chinese community got behind this and said, this is so unfair. And that problem still exists today. We back this up by the Wan Tong-ho incident in 1999, when the government decides that they want to investigate Chinese scholars, particularly scientific scholars, because they might be security risks or spies. And so poor Wan Tong-ho and his family, he was a Taiwanese American doing work at Los Alamos. He was accused of spying, but if you read the story, it was typical of a Chinese who said, oh, I've got to finish this project or this sentence or this paragraph or this paper. I'll take it home and do it, and that's what he did. And then he was found after several years that he was not guilty. And so in 2006, he got a settlement from the government for $1.6 million, but it didn't even cover the problems that he and his family had experienced during this time period.
从历史到今天，亚裔走过的每一步都在证明着我们在做美国人。亚裔无数次的面临的选择是负重前行与全力站队，还是试图推动系统上的改变呢？新的一代不断的脱颖而出，他们的所作所为可能让我们无法理解和认同，但这样的结果是理所当然的。亚裔运动的希望就在这里，当初的努力就是为了让每一个亚裔美国人自由的去做任何想要做的事情。历史的往复自有其道，哪怕我们能够从中间学到那么一点点，就能够避免重蹈覆辙。如果我们能够从历史当中找出有益文明进步的东西，再从中学习，我们就能够更好的前行。我们一起共勉之。